Hey guys, we're on part 3 of a 12-part series going through the book of Ecclesiastes. Today we're on chapter 3, and the question from chapter 3 is so key. The question is, what time is it? And Solomon writes this book likely at the end of his life, towards the end of his life. And I think prior to this time in his life, I think for most of his life, he was not asking, what time is it each day? Instead, I think most days he was thinking, how do I more fully grasp and understand everything going on around me? How do I more fully take control by wrapping my head around, by having greater wisdom around the inner workings of people and the dynamics of how life works? I think what Solomon, for most of his life, prided himself on was that he could be, for the most part, in control because he was the smartest, wisest person in the room. But what he learned by the end of his life was that no matter how hard he worked at it, no matter how wise he was, no matter how much control he perceived to achieve, it was never enough to guarantee his future. It was never enough to guarantee his safety. It was never enough, as he talks about so many times, to guarantee his satisfaction, his self-satisfaction, his own contentment. What he realizes by the end of his life is that life is completely out of his control, is out of anybody else's control except for God's. And so he writes these most famous of words from the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. This is the section where it says, for everything there is a season. For everything there's a time under heaven. There's a time to be born. There's a time to die. There's a time to plant. There's a time to harvest. There's a time to cry. There's a time to laugh. There's a time to embrace, and there's a time to turn away. Everything has its time, and it really sounds like everything has its appointed time. And he kind of explains this a little bit more, how it relates to us, how it impacts us in verses 10 and 11. He says, God has made everything beautiful, everything. This is the hard part to grasp. I think it's the hard part for him to grasp for most of his life. Everything, even the dying, even the grieving, even the crying, even the turning away and not embracing. Everything by God has been made beautiful in its own time. He says, God has planted eternity in the human heart. But, so in who we really are, everything is about eternity. Everything is about forever. There is no time. It's outside of time. Right? Everything happens in this beautiful mosaic. But within time, he says, but even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. Meaning, in time, as we live in time, in this carnal life that will eventually die, we can't see the mosaic. We can't see the beauty of the whole picture. It's still being painted in our eyes. But for God, he can see the eternity. He can see the mosaic. He can see how every piece fits. He can see how the mourning fits and the grieving fits and even the killing and the tearing down and the turning away. That's in there. That's in the list. Fits. And of course he can see how the laughing and the loving and the healing and the harvesting and the being born and the dancing, he says dancing, he sees how that fits. But they're not separate. They're the mosaic. And what he challenges us to do, and the conclusion that he comes to, really because at the end of the day, it's not a challenge, it's a realization for him. It's an aha moment for him at the end of his life. He says, the way to live is not by trying to understand every piece of the mosaic, of the painting. Like if this is paint by numbers, it's not, the way to live is not by wrapping our head around, what's the blue for up there? No. He says it's instead to step back. And whether we can see the whole painting or not, because within time, the constraints of time, we can't see the whole mosaic. But whether God kind of has the grace to give us a glimpse of it or not, he says it's instead to trust that God has made everything beautiful, good, bad, and the ugly, in its own time, in its own way, in its own season. This has been appointed. And so he says, The way to live is not to try to be in control of the future, especially. I want to make sure I'm prepared, make sure I'm safe, make sure I'm doing everything to achieve and be satisfied and content. But instead, the way to live is to ask this question every day, maybe even every moment of every day. God, here's the question, God, what time is it? What is the time today? And if the time today is a mourning, then, oh man, that hurts, but you mourn with me, and it fits somewhere, somehow, in the eternal mosaic. What time is it today? Oh, is it a time of joy and laughter? Okay, then wonderful. Let's fully experience that and not be worried about tomorrow might be a time of mourning. No, don't. Tomorrow has enough trouble of its own. Enjoy today. The question is, God, what time is it today? What time is it in this moment? And let me live fully in the faith and in the trust that it is beautiful because it fits into the singular mosaic of eternity that you have already painted and that you already see. And really the response is, thank you, God, that I get to be a part of all these seasons, of all these times that are a part of your forever masterpiece of life.